For assessments to be useful, they need to be able to make comparisons. Here we see Roderick scored 3 and Rachel scored 35. So my question might be, so what? Uh, Assessments are only as good as when they are able to compare to some sort of standard, some sort of criterion, some sort of expectation. Without appropriate comparisons, these statements mean very little. They need appropriate context. There are three different types of comparisons that assessments can typically make. We can make norm reference comparisons, we can make criterion reference comparisons, and self-reference comparisons. Next, we'll explore each of these. Criterion reference assessments make comparisons to some pre-existing standard, criteria, or line in the sand. So for example, they might ask the question, how does the learner compare to expectations or the desired level of performance? In theory, all could be above the line or all could be below the line with criterion reference comparisons. Some examples of these are 5 by September 15th to enter kindergarten, or a blood pressure of less than 120/80, or a temp of 98.6, or 20/20 vision during an IDOT exam. These are all comparisons to some sort of criterion reference. Eligibility in Iowa requires that when we do a disability determination, we are looking at the learner's performance compared to the standards that apply to all children. Iowa Core Standards, Iowa Early Learning Standards, they're a criterion referenced assessment. They don't change depending on who you look at or what school you look at. Those standards are the standards for children in Iowa. Norm reference comparisons make comparisons to others. We see here a normal curve. Each individual in the curve is represented, with most individuals represented in the middle to a bit in the extension of the curve. So when we make comparisons to the normal curve, we're really looking at the learners compared to a target group or a relative target group. So some language we can use when we talk about norm referenced assessments are in the top of the class, in the bottom quartile, at the 81st percentile on Iowa assessments. These are all norm reference types of assessments. We have to be careful of norm reference assessment. In a high functioning system, a learner at the 10th percentile may look deficient when we look at the assessment when really they're on track and meeting expectations based on criterions. So how can that be? Well, someone has to be at the 10th percentile, so someone has to be in the bottom 10 of 100 students. It doesn't mean that they are at risk or discrepant from expectations. So we have to be careful on what our norm is telling us. In a system with many universal needs, a learner at the 80th percentile may not be meeting standards, even though they're at the 80th percentile, high in the group. This type of data would aid in helping us determine if universal instruction is appropriate and the potential magnitude of a learner's needs if they're a learner with a disability. Some examples of norm-referenced assessments include Iowa assessments, IQ tests, Woodcock-Johnson achievement test, and graduating class rank. The third type of comparison is a comparison to oneself. This is pretty self-explanatory, I think. So we're really just comparing the student or the learner to themselves. We could measure growth from a starting point or baseline towards a well-established goal. Norms or criterion may or may not be relevant, and they may be more helpful in writing that ambitious goal. Some language that we can use when we're looking at a self-referenced assessment would be their learning trajectory, improving, their platitude. So these different types of comparisons, they're not mutually exclusive either. In fact, we can make each of the three different types of comparisons with the same data, if the comparison exists, that is. One could look at taking a reading rate of 100 words per minute or whatever and compare it to three standards. what percent rank is 100 words correct per minute compared to peers, which would be a norm reference. Is the student on track for end of the year success, which would be a criterion reference, and is 100 words per minute higher than last year, which would be a self-reference. These are all the same data, but different comparisons and interpretations. So as individuals who do evaluations, we have to be careful of what kinds of comparisons and for what purposes we're doing them. So in summary, we have looked at 3 big ideas in assessment fundamentals. We wanted to look at why we do assessments, and we looked at those key functions of assessments. We wanted to look at making the right comparisons, and we also wanted to look at those key components of making sound decisions.